Hello everyone, today I want to talk about how being America's mouthpiece is truly a sad thing. Trump is speeding up the sale of the Voice of America building. In addition, China has become a model for opposing the United States. The EU and Japan will only slow down negotiations with China on the US. The US is now offending the whole world, making diplomacy very difficult. President Trump's tariff war has not been going well. Aside from signing a lukewarm agreement with the UK, he also signed an agreement with China that the outside world sees as the US kneeling to China. Trump seems to be getting a bit impatient. He used to say that 90 countries were waiting to talk to him, then later claimed that 150 countries were lining up to negotiate with him, eager to kiss his ass. Now, it has turned into a situation where he doesn't even want to talk to most countries anymore. Trump said that 150 countries want to reach trade agreements with the United States, but Washington doesn't have enough time to negotiate with them one by one. Treasury Secretary Bessent and Commerce Secretary Roderick will, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, send letters to these trade partner countries to inform them how much tariff the United States will impose on them and tell them how much it will cost to do business in the US. Each country will also have the opportunity to appeal. Last month, Trump announced the imposition of reciprocal tariffs on trade partners, but then decided to postpone the implementation. The White House said that priority will be given to negotiations with the United States' largest trade partners such as India, South Korea, and Japan. Let's try to interpret what Trump means. He thinks, I've imposed tariffs on over 100 countries, even on a few small islands, and now all these countries are lining up to negotiate with me, but I don't really care anymore. So now the US will unilaterally announce how much tariff it will impose on them, and that's it. No more negotiations needed. From the American perspective, this approach is more practical. Otherwise, there's no way all the negotiations could be completed within the 90-day grace period. But from the perspective of the small countries being hit with tariffs, this approach is really quite blunt and heavy-handed. They don't even get a chance to negotiate. This method is very convenient in terms of trade, but diplomatically, it ends up offending most countries. The countries that the US unilaterally imposes tariffs on and refuses to negotiate with are naturally the smaller nations, which are the so-called Global South, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. China's approach is exactly the opposite. On September 5th last year, when President Xi Jinping attended the Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation at the Great Hall of the People, he stated that China is willing to proactively and unilaterally expand market access. He announced that China would grant zero tariff treatment to all tariff items for the least developed countries that have diplomatic relations with China, including 33 African countries, making China the first major developing country and major world economy to implement such a measure. One country is wildly increasing tariffs on others, not even giving them a chance to negotiate. Meanwhile, another country is unilaterally and unconditionally opening up to zero tariffs for poor nations. Given this, why would countries in the Global South want to follow America's lead in the future? By acting this way, the United States is isolating itself from the Global South. In the face of the US's all-around tariff blackmail, China has stood firm and refused to back down. As a result, it achieved positive outcomes, signed agreements with the US, and inspired other countries to follow suit. On May 18th, Bloomberg published an article stating that many countries have learned from China that they need to maintain a firm stance against the United States and remain calm. Many countries are beginning to believe that the Trump administration has overestimated its own strength. They are starting to reflect on whether their previous diplomatic policies toward the US and their eagerness to negotiate quickly were correct, and whether they need to adopt a tougher stance toward the United States. The article states that the mainland made significant concessions to the Chinese side, which surprised governments from South Korea to the European Union. These governments had previously complied with US requests for negotiations and had not retaliated against US tariffs. Bloomberg says that China's tough stance in negotiations with the United States has led some countries to believe that they need to adopt a more hardline approach in their own trade talks with the Trump administration. The article bluntly states that after China's tough negotiation strategy resulted in a favorable trade agreement, those countries that had taken a more diplomatic approach and sought a quick resolution began to question whether they had chosen the right way to negotiate. Former US Trade Representative and current visiting senior fellow at Singapore's Iseas Yusof Ishak Institute, Olson, said that this has changed their negotiating attitude. Many countries are examining the outcomes of negotiations among China, the US, India, and ASEAN, and have concluded that Trump has begun to realize he overestimated his own strength. Although officials from various countries are reluctant to publicly acknowledge any hardening of their stance, there are signs, especially among some major powers, that they have realized they possess more leverage than they previously thought, and that they have the ability to slow down the pace of negotiations. Japan is one such example. Japanese diplomats had planned to visit Washington this week, but they are no longer in a hurry. Notably, Japan's Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, Yuji Muto, was absent from last week's APEC Trade Ministers meeting, which was attended by US Trade Representative Greer. Japan's chief trade negotiator, Akasaki Ryo, had originally said earlier this month that he hoped to reach an agreement with the United States in June, but recent reports in the Japanese media indicate that it may be postponed until before the Japanese House of Councillors election in July. Japanese decision-makers seem to have begun to realize that, rather than making major concessions in haste, it is wiser to extend the negotiation period. As for U.S. officials, they have also begun to soften their stance, saying that the negotiations will take longer. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Roderick recently told Bloomberg that negotiations with Japan and South Korea will require more time. In addition, the European Union has also started to slow down. U.S. Treasury Secretary Benson said that, due to the lack of a unified position within the EU, negotiations between the U.S. and Europe may proceed even more slowly. An anonymous source familiar with the EU discussions believes that the meager results achieved by the US in the China-US negotiations, as well as the lack of a clear final objective for both sides to discuss during the 90-day grace period, have exposed the Trump administration's limited willingness and significant constraints in continuing to put pressure on China. Now, the EU's appetite has grown. According to the Wall Street Journal, several EU officials have hinted that the EU is seeking to reach a trade agreement with tariff reductions greater than those in the US, UK, and US-China deals. Some EU officials have said that the terms offered by the US to the UK and China are not enough to satisfy the EU. The EU learned one thing from the last round of negotiations: there is no need to rush. It can be summed up like this. First, the United States is short on money and now lacks the patience to negotiate with a large number of countries, so it simply issues tariff lists to try to collect money directly. You have to understand, if the US were to impose a 10% tariff across the board on the whole world, its annual revenue would increase by $300 billion. However, such heavy-handed actions by the US will only push countries in the global south further into China's camp. Second, the US is entangled in debt and is unable to reach an agreement with China. But after a China-US agreement was reached, major powers like the EU and Japan started to sigh in relief, began to emulate China's tough stance, and were in no hurry to reach agreements with the United States. With this whole tariff drama, the US now seems a bit at a loss as to how to wrap things up. In addition, since Trump can't handle international affairs, he continues to deal with domestic issues in a heavy-handed way. According to the New York Times, on May 12th, the US government laid off 600 contract employees from Voice of America and the US Agency for Global Media, which is one-third of Voice of America's total staff of 1,350. Those affected include editors, reporters, graphic designers, and others. Among them, 50 people will have their contracts expire at the end of the month. They are staying in the United States on J-Pass 1 visas, which means if their jobs are not secured, they must leave the country within 30 days. On the same day, Bloomberg quoted sources saying that Trump is considering selling the Voice of America headquarters building, which will be included on the list of assets to be expedited for disposal in order to reduce government property holdings. The official name of this building is the Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building, located south of the National Mall, just 2 blocks from the U.S. Capitol. This historic building covers 1 million square feet and was completed in 1940. It originally served as the headquarters of the U.S. Social Security Administration. Voice of America moved into this building in 1954. The offices of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees Voice of America, as well as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, are also located in this building. Last year, the Biden administration approved Voice of America's relocation to a newly selected modern office building in Washington. They are renting this new building at a high price, having signed a 15-year lease. However, in March of this year, Michael Pack, the head and senior advisor of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, appointed by Trump, decided to cancel this lease and attempted to shut down Voice of America and other federally operated broadcasters. Now, taking things a step further, they even plan to sell the headquarters building itself, demonstrating the Trump administration's determination to go after Voice of America. This also means that even if Voice of America manages to get Congress or the courts to overturn Trump's budget cuts, Trump has no intention of complying. Earlier, a U.S. federal judge also issued an order requiring the Trump administration to bring back Garcia, an undocumented immigrant who was sent to Serbia and held in a facility worse than a prison. However, the Trump administration ignored the court order and simply refused to take any action. So it's really not easy for Voice of America to make a comeback. Michael Pack, the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees Voice of America, said he would rely on One America News Network, a cable TV channel with pro-Trump hosts, to provide programming for the government-run network. In other words, he plans to replace Voice of America's programming with content produced by a group of pro-Trump individuals. In addition, the plan to sell the Voice of America headquarters appears to be inevitable, but according to U.S. federal law, surplus property must first be offered to government agencies and non-profit organizations before it can be sold to private bidders. However, the U.S. General Services Administration stated that by placing the property sale into an accelerated process, they would be able to complete the legally required procedures simultaneously while buyers conduct due diligence on the property. After the US government earlier announced the closure of Voice of America appealed to the court. Although a federal judge temporarily halted the plan to shut down Voice of America, the appeals court later ruled that during the period when Voice of America was challenging the dismissal decision, Trump could continue to withhold or allocate funds to the agency. It can be summarized as follows. First, the demise of Voice of America is, in fact, a lament for those who serve as America's mouthpiece. In the past, they always thought that holding a federal government job was a guaranteed iron rice bowl, allowing them to play their own little games. Who could have imagined that after just one weekend, they would no longer be able to enter the office, and soon after, be laid off? The US government's practice of discarding its mouthpieces once they've served their purpose is so cold-hearted that even outsiders find it chilling. Second, the mission of Voice of America is to tell America's story to the world and promote so-called democracy and freedom. But in reality, much of the time it is engaged in a war of public opinion against America's rival countries. In addition to stirring up trouble and interfering in the internal affairs of other countries around the world, it sometimes even advocates for color revolutions. However, now that the US is short on money, Trump feels that even propaganda can be dispensed with. Let the United States blatantly pressure other countries, blatantly ask them for money, blatantly seize their mineral resources. It's all acceptable now. So why bother with the packaging of democracy and freedom for propaganda anymore?